Welcome back to the final video of the spring 2026 breakdown of the UIL brief. Today we're going to focus on the autonomy negative case. So instead of getting bogged down in math, who creates more jobs, who lowers prices, the autonomy neg moves the debate to a higher plane of political agency, right? It argues that if a developing nation loses its ability to govern itself, it doesn't matter how rich it gets, it's failed the test of justice. So basically this negative case is going to argue that multinational corporations through globalization come in and they basically replace governments. They create huge lobbying efforts that prevent local governments and developing nations from developing on their own, and that prevents justice from occurring for the individuals of that country. So let's get into the framework, impacts, and solvency about this case. So let's start with the framework. The value is justice. We use the Palmer-Lew evidence to define it as giving each person their due. However, we add a crucial layer from the Marion-Young evidence that we get into after that argues that justice isn't a universal theorem we find in a book. It's something we find by listening to the specific suffering and needs of particular societies. So this is a brilliant counter to affirmative global studies, right? You can tell the judge that after 110 country study doesn't matter because justice is situated. We need to listen to the specific needs of this developing nation, not a global average, right? So that spills into the criterion, which is going to be essentially respecting autonomy, protecting autonomy, right? To achieve justice, we have to protect autonomy. Autonomy is the ability of a person or a group to choose their own course or plan of action, right? The Chrisman evidence explains that autonomy is the model of the citizen. If a policy is coercive, meaning it forces a country to do something against its will, it's inherently unjust. And as Simmons specifically notes, states only have the power of their citizens that citizens voluntarily grant them, right? Since globalization is often pushed by nations by the IMF or the World Bank, it violates that voluntary agreement of developing nations entering the globalized economy on their own. It's going to be a huge theme throughout this case, right? So let's get into the impacts of it through the contentions. So the first contention is going to be globalization harming autonomy. So we look at this piece of Cater and 13 evidence that describes what is called the routine of dependency in Latin America. That when a country accepts globalization and IMF loans, they aren't just getting money, they are getting permanent guests in their government. The Cater evidence notes that central banks must send weekly reports to Washington, and IMF officials often have a permanent presence in local economic institutions. This isn't cooperation, it's reliance, it's a loss of independence. This happens in education as well, as the Chun and 424 evidence explains that globalization leads to the commercialization of schools, leads to a standardization, where global frameworks wipe out local knowledge and cultural nuances that are specific to the localized governments and the economies that people need. It also leads to brain drain, where skilled educators flee to richer nations for higher salaries because of open up globalization, leaving developing systems kind of hollowed out, which prevents them from becoming developed nations, and instead they just become financial opportunities for more developed nations like the United States, China, Russia. So that is how, a form of globalization prevents autonomy within developing nations themselves because it forces them to shape their education policies to favor, multinational corporations. It also, forces them to accept, having like the IMF, World Bank, essentially, corporations and boards forced and focused or basically founded by, some of these higher developed countries like the United States and China, which are designed in order for them to be able to go into countries, hollow out their resources for their own gain, and kind of leave the people there to starve, leave the people there without any benefits from what has occurred based on globalization, what has occurred when these multinational corporations come in and buy out localized farmers, displace localized farmers, right? That's what happens through globalization. It's something that protectionism can, uniquely prevent. So then we get into the next contention, which is financial flexibility. So globalization uniquely binds countries to a system they cannot control. The Kepler 24 evidence points to what is called the fragile five, the countries of Brazil, India, Indonesia, Turkey, South Africa, and that in a crisis, central bank is supposed to be the lender of last resort, but because globalization encourages foreign currency deposits, those banks lose their power. They literally run out of liquidity needed to save their own economies, which is what happened in those five countries. And Joseph Stiglitz famously noted that countries following IMF rules during the 1997 Asian economic crisis took longer to recover than those that chose their own path through protectionist policies, which can prove as to why protectionism is a better mechanism for developing nations to boost their own, boosts their own economies, and prevents globalized infiltration and invasion of a lot of their um, industries. So, how does prioritizing protectionism solve for the problem of autonomy? So, there are a couple of reasons why restoring domestic control of industry can do that. Right, first is economic sovereignty. Protectionism allows a government to prioritize, localized economies, and it ensures that the decisions about land, energy, and labor are made in the capital city of the developing nation, not in a boardroom in Washington or Geneva. Right. Second is educational relevance. By rejecting global standardized curricula, nations can shape education that fits their specific culture and economic needs, helping to stop the brain drain aspect of it. And finally, we got crisis resilience. When a country prioritizes its own industry and currency through protectionism, its central bank maintains the theoretical limit to create liquidity. It can actually act as a shield during a global financial storm because it isn't chained to foreign investors who might flee at any given moment. So, how do you win with the autonomy negative? We'll keep these points in mind. First is the coercion argument. Use the framework to argue that even if globalization makes a country richer, it is immoral that if that wealth comes at the cost of being bossed around by organizations like the IMF or bossed around by countries like the United States. Second, think about the fragile five, right? Use the helper evidence to show that globalization makes countries vulnerable. It's like building a house with no walls. It's great when the sun is out, but when it collapses in a storm, right? It collapses the economy in a major way because they don't have the industries in place to protect themselves when these foreign investors start to flee the moment crisis comes. Third, listen to the people, right? Use Young's philosophy. Tell the judge that justice starts by hearing the cry of distress from local farmers, local teachers, not the data from international banks that support globalization, right? Rather, show why the people that are in these developing nations need protectionism to protect their own industries. So while the affirmative offers the developing world offers the developing nations a seat at the global table, but the negative reminds us that if you're not specifically the ones that are making the policies, making the negotiations, that you're not going to be actually have a seat at this table. Rather, you're just another country that's going to be exploited by these more developed countries. So that's been the breakdown of the 2026 UIL brief. Make sure to focus on the true aspects of the people, and whether you're focused on the AF or the NEG side of things, focus on the people of these developing nations, and you're going to have a lot better time debating in front of these judges.